In the year 260 CE, Emperor Valerian, ruler of the Roman Empire, commander of the world's most powerful military, and the most important person on the planet, walked into a peace negotiation with the Persian king Shapur I and was never seen again. Not died in battle and we know where, never seen again. The sources can't agree on what happened to him. Some say he was kept as a living trophy and used as a human footstool for the Persian king to mount his horse. Others claim he was flayed alive and his skin was stuffed and displayed in a Persian temple for centuries. Still others suggest he was forced to drink molten gold. The truth? We have absolutely no idea. The Roman emperor, the most documented, most protected, most important person in the ancient world, simply vanished into Persian captivity, and the historical record goes silent. His fate remains unknown to this day, but Valerian wasn't the only Roman emperor to disappear into historical mystery. The crisis of the 3rd century was so chaotic that multiple emperors died in circumstances so confused that historians still debate what actually happened to them. Some were supposedly assassinated, but their bodies were never found. Others vanished during battles with no clear record of their deaths. A few were deposed and pensioned off, then completely disappear from history as if they never existed. And the very last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was removed from power in 476 CE, given a pension, and then nothing. He just stops appearing in any historical records. Did he live quietly in retirement? Was he secretly murdered? Did he become a monk? No one knows. The teenager who technically presided over the end of the Western Roman Empire vanished as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. Welcome to History Unleashed, where we explore the historical mysteries that reveal how little we actually know about the past. I'm your host, and today we're investigating the Roman emperors who vanished without a trace, where we'll discover why the most powerful men in the ancient world could disappear so completely, explore the genuine mysteries surrounding emperors whose fates remain unknown, despite centuries of scholarship. Examine what these disappearances reveal about the chaos and violence of imperial Rome. Investigate the wild theories about what happened to these vanished rulers, and understand why even for people who should have been meticulously documented, history can lose track completely. If you're ready to discover that the capture of Emperor Valerian was such an unprecedented disaster that Romans tried to pretend it never happened, that the crisis of the 3rd century was so violent that emperors were dying faster than historians could document their deaths, that Romulus Augustulus vanished so thoroughly that we don't even know if he lived to age 20 or 80, and that for all Rome's record-keeping and documentation, powerful people could still simply disappear from history when circumstances were chaotic enough. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we're about to explore combines historical mystery with the fundamental question of how we know anything about the past when even emperors can vanish. So prepare yourself for a journey into historical mystery, where the most powerful men on Earth disappeared into chaos, where theories range from plausible to absurd, and where the gaps in our knowledge reveal how fragile historical memory truly is. Chapter 1. Valerian. The Emperor who became a footstool, the story of Emperor. Valerian is simultaneously the most famous and most mysterious imperial disappearance, a catastrophe so unprecedented and humiliating that Romans tried to suppress information about it, creating a historical fog where we know he was captured by the Persians around 260 CE, but the exact circumstances of his capture and what happened to him afterward remain frustratingly unclear, with sources providing wildly contradictory accounts that range from relatively dignified captivity to horrifying torture and humiliation. What we do know is that Valerian's disappearance was the worst disaster to befall a Roman emperor up to that point. The first time a sitting Roman emperor was captured by a foreign enemy, and the mystery of his fate has fascinated and horrified historians for over 700 years. Valerian came to power in 253 CE during the crisis of the 3rd century, a period when the Roman Empire was fragmenting under pressure from external invasions, internal civil wars, economic collapse, and plague. He was already elderly when he became emperor, around 60 years old, and immediately faced multiple crises, including Germanic invasions in the north, rebellions in the provinces, and most seriously, the aggressive expansion of the Sassanid Persian Empire in the east under King Shapur I. Valerian decided to personally lead armies against the Persian threat, making the eastern frontier his priority. The campaigns against Persia initially went reasonably well, with Valerian stabilizing the frontier and conducting successful operations. But around 259–260 CE, the situation deteriorated rapidly. A devastating plague swept through Roman forces, weakening the army. Persian forces counterattacked successfully, besieging Roman cities and threatening to overrun the eastern provinces. Valerian found himself in Edessa, modern Şanlıurfa in Turkey, with an army that was depleted, diseased, and struggling to hold against Persian forces. The capture itself is where the historical record becomes deeply problematic. Roman sources are vague, contradictory, or silent about exactly how the emperor was captured. The official Roman version seems to be that Valerian agreed to negotiations with Shapur, possibly seeking a peace treaty or trying to buy time. He went to meet the Persian king with minimal escort, either because the meeting was supposed to be under truce or because he was foolishly overconfident, and the Persians violated the truce and seized him. This version presents Valerian as a victim of Persian treachery, maintaining his honor while explaining the catastrophe. The Persian version, as depicted in the famous relief carvings at Nakshi Rustam showing Shapur's triumphs, presents the capture differently. These reliefs show Roman emperors, likely Gordian III, Philip the Arab, and Valerian, in various states of submission before Shapur, with one figure clearly kneeling or prostrate, possibly representing Valerian's humiliation. The Persian inscriptions describe Valerian's capture as happening in battle, claiming that Shapur defeated a Roman army of 70,000 men and captured the emperor, presenting it as a military victory rather than a diplomatic betrayal. What happened to Valerian after his capture is where things get truly mysterious and disturbing. We have no reliable eyewitness accounts, no Roman source with direct knowledge of his fate, and instead have a collection of later stories that may be propaganda, embellishment, or complete fabrication. The most famous and horrifying account comes from the Christian writer Lactantius, writing around 60 years after the events, who claims that Valerian was kept as a permanent prisoner and used as a human footstool. Whenever Shapur wanted to mount his horse, he would step on the living Roman emperor's back to climb into the saddle. Lactantius continues with even more gruesome details, claiming that when Valerian finally died in captivity, Shapur had his skin flayed from his body, dyed red and stuffed, creating a grotesque trophy that was displayed in a Persian temple for centuries as a permanent humiliation of Rome. Lactantius presents this as divine punishment for Valerian's persecution of Christians, adding a moralizing element to what was already a horror story. But here's the critical question: is any of this true? Lactantius was writing decades later, had no direct knowledge of Persian court practices, and had obvious religious political reasons to present Valerian's fate as punishment from God. Other sources provide different versions. The Byzantine historian John Malalas, writing in the 6th century, over 250 years after the events, claims that Valerian was forced to drink molten gold as punishment for Rome's greed. This is almost certainly false, as forcing someone to drink molten gold would kill them instantly through burning and thermal shock, and keeping a prisoner alive to humiliate would be more valuable than quickly killing them. The story feels like propaganda designed to paint Persians as barbaric and to moralize about Roman avarice. Some sources suggest Valerian was treated with relative respect as a prisoner, kept alive but in captivity, perhaps used for propaganda purposes but not actively tortured. This version is less dramatic but might be more plausible. Why would Shapur kill or permanently mutilate such a valuable prisoner when keeping the Roman emperor alive and showing him to visitors would be far more impressive? A living emperor in chains is better propaganda than a dead emperor. However, he was killed. The complete silence from Roman sources about Valerian's fate is itself telling. If Valerian had been treated honorably, or if his death had been dignified, or if he'd been killed quickly in battle, Romans would have documented it. The fact that Roman sources largely avoid discussing what happened suggests they knew nothing reliable, or what they knew was so humiliating that they chose not to record it. This silence speaks to a collective Roman decision to simply not discuss the emperor's fate, as if by not acknowledging the humiliation, it could be erased from memory. The Persian sources are more triumphant but also frustratingly vague about specific details. The Nakshi Rustam reliefs show Persian victories over Rome, but don't provide narrative details about what happened to Valerian specifically. The inscriptions celebrate Shapur's triumph, but don't describe the emperor's treatment or death. The Persians clearly wanted to advertise their victory over Rome, but the specific fate of the captured emperor isn't detailed in surviving Persian sources. The archaeological evidence is no help either. No Roman artifacts clearly associated with Valerian have been found in Persian territory. No tomb, no memorial, no relics that could be definitively identified as coming from the emperor. If the story about his flayed skin being displayed in a temple is true, that artifact would have been priceless for establishing what actually happened. But no such relic survives, if it ever existed. The political context helps explain the mystery. Valerian's son Gallienus, who had been co-emperor and took full power after his father's capture, faced an impossible situation. Acknowledging that his father was captured and was suffering humiliation in Persia would undermine his own legitimacy and authority. Gallienus needed to present himself as strong and capable, not as the son of an emperor who died in shameful captivity. So the official Roman response was essentially silence. Don't talk about it. Don't acknowledge the humiliation. Treat Valerian's reign as if it had ended when he went east, and move forward. This deliberate suppression of information about Valerian's fate created the historical vacuum we're dealing with. The Romans who knew what happened, if any survived and returned from Persian captivity, apparently didn't write it down or their accounts didn't survive. The Persians told their triumphant version but without specific details. Later writers filled the void with increasingly dramatic stories that served their rhetorical purposes, rather than preserving accurate information. And so, one of the most significant events in Roman history, the capture of a reigning emperor, becomes one of its greatest mysteries. The theories about what really happened range from the horrifying to the mundane. The flayed skin story might be true but is probably exaggerated. Persian treatment of prisoners varied, but permanent mutilation of such a valuable captive seems pointless. The human footstool story might be partially true. Some ritual humiliation seems plausible, but the specific details are questionable. The simplest explanation is that Valerian died in captivity from disease, old age, or execution, and his body was either buried somewhere in Persia, returned to Rome and buried quietly to avoid scandal, or disposed of in ways that left no archaeological trace. But we simply don't know. The impact of Valerian's capture and disappearance on Roman consciousness was profound. It demonstrated that even emperors weren't safe, that Rome's enemies could humiliate Rome at the highest level, and that the empire was vulnerable in ways previously unimaginable. The mystery of his fate, whether deliberately created by Roman suppression of information or simply resulting from the chaos of the period, has ensured that Valerian's disappearance remains one of history's most fascinating imperial mysteries. From which country are you watching this? Because Valerian's disappearance shows how even the most powerful and supposedly well-documented people can vanish from history when political circumstances make recording their fate inconvenient, or when chaos prevents reliable documentation. What historical disappearances from your country remain mysterious? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're shocked that a Roman emperor could simply vanish, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to explore the crisis of the 3rd century, when emperors were disappearing so frequently that keeping track became nearly impossible. Chapter 2: The Crisis of the 3rd Century. When emperors vanished like mayflies while Valerian, his capture and mysterious fate was the most dramatic imperial disappearance. It occurred during a broader period, called the Crisis of the 3rd Century, roughly 235–284 CE, when the Roman Empire nearly collapsed entirely and emperors died with such alarming frequency, over 50 legitimate or disputed emperors in 50 years, that historians still struggled to establish basic facts about who ruled when, how they died, and what happened to their bodies. Some of these emperors ruled for mere months before being assassinated, killed in battle, or dying in circumstances so confused that we genuinely don't know what happened to them. The chaos was so extreme that multiple emperors simply vanished from the historical record, with their ultimate fates unknown, their deaths unconfirmed, and sometimes even uncertainty about whether they actually ruled at all. The crisis began in 235 CE, when Emperor Severus Alexander and his mother, Julia Mamaea, were murdered by their own troops near Mainz, Germany, the soldiers proclaimed Maximinus Thrax as emperor, establishing a pattern that would repeat endlessly. Armies making and unmaking emperors, military commanders seizing power through force, and political instability becoming the norm rather than the exception. Over the next 50 years, emperors would die in every possible way, murdered by their own soldiers, killed in civil wars against rival emperors, falling in battle against foreign enemies, succumbing to plague, assassinated by political rivals, and in some cases, simply vanishing in ways that left their fate unclear. Emperor Gordian I and his son Gordian II ruled for only 22 days in 238 CE, during what historians call the Year of the Six Emperors. They were proclaimed emperors in Africa, fought against the existing emperor Maximinus Thrax, and both died during their brief reign. Gordian II was killed in battle, we know that much, but his father Gordianer's death is more mysterious. Some sources say he committed suicide when he learned of his son's death. Others say he was murdered by supporters of the opposing faction. The confusion exists because both died in Africa during chaotic circumstances, and the reliable sources were more concerned with who succeeded them than with the precise details of how they died. Emperor Philip the Arab, who ruled 244–249 CE, is another mysterious case. He was fighting the usurper Decius when his army was defeated in 249 CE near Verona. Philip apparently died in the battle, but the circumstances are unclear. Some sources say he was killed by his own troops, who then proclaimed Decius emperor. Others suggest he died fighting in the battle itself. Still others claim he survived the initial defeat but was killed shortly after. His body was either never recovered or was recovered and buried quietly, without the proper ceremonies you'd expect for a fallen emperor. The confusion suggests that the victorious Decius's faction had reasons to be vague about exactly how Philip died, either to obscure the fact that his own soldiers murdered him or to avoid detailing his final moments. Emperor Aemilianus ruled for only about 3 months in 253 CE before being murdered by his own troops. The circumstances of his death are clear enough. His soldiers killed him when they decided to support a rival claimant. But what happened to his body is unknown. Was he buried? Was his body thrown away like trash? Did his family recover it for proper burial? There's no record. An emperor who ruled over the entire Roman Empire, albeit briefly, was killed and disposed of with apparently no one bothering to document what happened to his remains. Emperor Gallienus, Valerian's son who ruled 253–268 CE and dealt with his father's mysterious disappearance, himself died under suspicious circumstances. He was assassinated by his own officers in 268 CE while besieging Milan. The assassination is documented, but the details are confused. Some sources say he was killed by a conspiracy of his senior commanders. Others suggest the plot was more spontaneous. What happened during his final moments and what was done with his body afterward is documented vaguely. He was apparently buried quickly and without proper ceremony, which suggests the conspirators wanted to move on rather than dwell on the murder they'd just committed. Emperor Claudius II Gothicus, who succeeded Gallienus and ruled 268–270 CE, supposedly died of plague in Sirmium, modern Serbia. This seems straightforward enough. Plague killed many during this period, but some sources suggest his death might not have been from disease but from assassination disguised as plague death, or that he was already sick and was murdered because his illness made him weak. The confusion exists because multiple parties had incentives to either confirm the plague story to avoid association with imperial assassination or to suggest murder to discredit his successor Aurelian. Emperor Quintillus, who briefly ruled after Claudius II's death for anywhere from 17 to 177 days depending on which source you believe, died in 270 CE under completely unclear circumstances. Some sources say his own troops murdered him. Others say he committed suicide when he realized his rival Aurelian had more support. Still others suggest he died from wounds received in battle. The fact that we can't even nail down how long he ruled or how he died shows how chaotic record-keeping had become. The Gallic Empire, a breakaway state that existed 260–274 CE encompassing Gaul, Britain, and Hispania, had its own succession of emperors whose fates are sometimes mysterious. Postumus, the first Gallic emperor, ruled reasonably successfully for about a decade before being killed by his own troops in 269 CE in circumstances that are confused. Did his soldiers kill him because he forbade them from sacking a city they'd captured? Did rival commanders assassinate him? What happened to his body? The sources disagree. Victorinus, another Gallic emperor who ruled 269–271 CE, was supposedly murdered in Cologne by a jealous husband whose wife Victorinus had seduced. This is almost too perfect a story. The leader killed by sexual jealousy, which makes historians suspicious that it might be moralizing fiction rather than fact. He was certainly killed by someone, and his death led to his successor taking power. But whether the cuckolded husband story is true, or whether that's a convenient explanation covering up a more political assassination, remains unclear. The Palmyrene Empire, another breakaway state in the east led by Queen Zenobia, provides more mysterious fates. After Emperor Aurelian conquered Palmyra in 272 CE, the fate of Zenobia herself is unclear. Some sources say Aurelian captured her and brought her to Rome, where she was displayed in his triumph, before being given a villa and living out her life as a respectable Roman matron. Other sources suggest she died en route to Rome, possibly by suicide or possibly from illness. Later legend claims she married a Roman senator and established a family in Rome, but this is probably fiction. The truth is that after her capture, Zenobia disappears from reliable historical sources, and her ultimate fate is unknown. Emperor Aurelian himself, who restored the empire's unity and probably saved Rome from collapse, was murdered by his own officers in 275 CE in Thrace, under circumstances that are well documented as conspiracies go. His secretary forged documents making it look like Aurelian was planning to execute several officers who then killed him preemptively. But what happened immediately after his death is confused. Who controlled his body? Was he buried with honor or disposed of quickly? Did his murderers get away with it or face punishment? The sources are vague, suggesting that the period immediately after his assassination was chaotic, and people were more concerned with political survival than with proper record-keeping. The pattern across all these cases is similar. Emperors died in chaotic circumstances, often violently, during periods of extreme instability when record-keeping was disrupted, when political incentives existed to obscure the truth, when multiple contradictory accounts circulated, and when no authoritative source existed to definitively establish what happened. The people who could have documented these emperors' fates, court officials, soldiers' family members, were either dead, scattered, unconcerned with historical accuracy, or actively invested in promoting particular versions of events. The archaeological evidence is limited because emperors during the crisis of the 3rd century often weren't buried with the elaborate tombs and monuments that emperors in more stable periods received. Many were probably buried quickly in unmarked graves or in locations that have since been lost. The political instability meant that no one had the time, resources, or political capital to commission proper imperial memorials. The emperors were dead, new emperors were already in power, and everyone was too busy trying to survive the crisis to worry about properly commemorating the recently dead. The broader lesson is that historical record-keeping depends on stable institutions and people who care about documenting events accurately. During periods of extreme chaos, both of these requirements disappear. Institutions collapse or are too overwhelmed to maintain records. People are focused on immediate survival rather than historical documentation. And the result is that even major events like emperors dying can become historical mysteries when circumstances prevent proper recording and later sources can't reconstruct what actually happened. From which country are you watching this? Because the crisis of the 3rd century shows how historical knowledge depends on stable record-keeping, and how quickly we can lose track of even major events during chaotic periods. What periods of crisis in your country's history resulted in gaps in the historical record? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're amazed by how many emperors simply vanished, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to meet the last Western Roman emperor, who disappeared so completely we don't know if he lived to 20 or 80. Or Chapter 3, Romulus Augustulus. The last emperor who vanished into obscurity. The story of Romulus Augustulus is simultaneously tragic and farcical. He was around 15 or 16 years old when his father installed him as Western Roman emperor in 475 CE. He had virtually no real power as a puppet ruler. He reigned for less than a year before being deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer in 476 CE, an event traditionally marked as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and then he completely disappears from history. We don't know when he died, where he died, how he died, or what he did with the remaining decades of his potentially long life after ceasing to be emperor. The last Western Roman emperor, the person who technically presided over Rome's final collapse, vanished so thoroughly that we can't even determine whether he lived to age 20 or age 80. Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, was a diminutive or nickname. His real name was Romulus Augustus, came to power through his father Orestes, a military commander who had served Attila the Hun before entering Roman service. Orestes led a military coup deposing the previous emperor Julius Nepos in 475 CE, but rather than taking the throne himself, installed his teenage son as emperor while retaining real power. This dynastic arrangement was probably meant to establish Orestes' family as a ruling house. But it never had time to solidify because Odoacer, another Germanic general, rebelled less than a year later. Odoacer defeated and killed Orestes in August 476 CE, then marched on Ravenna where young Romulus Augustulus was residing. The city apparently surrendered without significant resistance, likely because no one was particularly invested in defending a teenage puppet emperor who commanded no loyalty. What happened next is where the mystery begins. Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, ending his brief reign, but notably did not kill him. Instead, according to the few sources that mention this at all, Odoacer gave the former emperor and his family a pension and allowed them to retire to a villa or estate. The location of this retirement is disputed. Some sources place it at the Castellum Lucullanum in Campania, near Naples, which was a fortified villa that had previously served as a gilded cage for other deposed figures. Other sources suggest different locations, but wherever young Romulus was sent, he disappears completely from historical records after 476 CE. Not a single reliable source mentions him again. No death notice, no record of his final years, no mention of his activities, nothing. The last Western Roman emperor simply vanished from history as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. The theories about what happened to Romulus Augustulus range from the mundane to the dramatic. The most straightforward theory is that he lived quietly in retirement, possibly for many decades, enjoying his pension and staying completely out of politics and public life. If he was around 16 in 476 CE, he could have easily lived into the 500s or even 510s, potentially witnessing the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, the Byzantine attempts to reconquer Italy, and the slow transformation of the former Western Roman Empire. But if he lived this long, it's remarkable that no source mentions him at all. You'd think someone would note the last Roman emperor is still alive in his 60s, living quietly near Naples. Another theory suggests that Romulus retired to religious life, possibly becoming a monk. Monastic retreat was a common fate for deposed rulers in the late Roman and medieval periods, offering a respectable way to remove defeated rivals from politics while ensuring their survival. If Romulus entered a monastery, possibly under an assumed name or simply as an anonymous monk, this could explain why historical sources lose track of him. Monks lived outside the world of imperial politics and high society where historical sources focused their attention. Darker theory proposes that Odoacer or his successors had Romulus Augustulus quietly murdered after allowing some time to pass, possibly to eliminate even the theoretical threat of a legitimate Roman claimant who could be used by rivals. The pension and retirement might have been temporary measures to avoid the bad optics of immediately executing a teenager. But once public attention moved elsewhere, Romulus could have been disposed of without causing scandal. This would explain the complete silence about his fate. Murdered former emperors don't get obituaries. The possibility exists that Romulus Augustulus lived quietly under an assumed identity, perhaps changing his name and completely abandoning any connection to his imperial past. If he wanted to truly escape the political dangers of being a former emperor, adopting a new identity and living anonymously would be the safest strategy. This would make him essentially impossible to track historically, because he'd deliberately erased himself from the historical record. But this theory requires assuming he lived in fear of assassination and never revealed his identity to anyone who left a written record, which seems unlikely if he lived for decades. Some fringe theories suggest Romulus Augustulus escaped Italy entirely, perhaps fleeing to Constantinople, Britain, or even farther afield. These theories lack any evidentiary support and are mostly wishful thinking by people who want the last Roman emperor to have had exotic adventures after his deposition. The reality is that a deposed teenager with no money, no supporters, and no power base wasn't going anywhere exciting. If he survived, he almost certainly lived quietly in Italy. The name Romulus Augustulus itself might have been changed, which could contribute to the mystery. Romulus Augustulus combined Rome's founder Romulus with Augustus, the first emperor, creating a name that was either optimistic or darkly ironic, depending on your perspective. If he survived, he might have used his original name Romulus Augustus, or a completely different name, making him harder to identify in later records. The comparison to other deposed late Roman emperors is instructive. Julius Nepos, the emperor Romulus's father had deposed, fled to Dalmatia and continued claiming to be emperor until his assassination in 480 CE. We know what happened to him. Avitus, an earlier deposed emperor, became bishop of Piacenza, and his later life is documented. Glycerius, another deposed emperor, became bishop of Salona, and his activities are recorded. These men remained in historical records because they took on new roles that kept them in the documentary record. Romulus Augustulus apparently did none of these things, or if he did, we've lost all trace of it. The fact that even the Byzantine Empire, which maintained claims to be the continuing Roman Empire and kept extensive records, never mentions Romulus Augustulus after his deposition is telling. If he'd lived to any significant age, surely someone in Constantinople would have noted, the last Western emperor is still alive in Italy. The Byzantine silence suggests either that he died young and unremarkably, or that he'd become so completely irrelevant that Byzantine chroniclers didn't consider his continued existence worth mentioning. The symbolic appropriateness of the last Western Roman emperor vanishing without trace has made some historians suspicious that the disappearance might be too perfect. Rome's final emperor was named Romulus Augustus, combining the city's legendary founder with its first emperor. Could this be later historical invention rather than his real name? He vanishes completely, providing no details that might contradict the neat narrative of Rome ending in 476 CE. Might later chroniclers have deliberately obscured his fate to maintain this clean historical breakpoint? Most historians think the basic facts are real and the disappearance is genuinely mysterious rather than constructed. But the narrative tidiness is suspicious enough to warrant skepticism. The broader context of the late 5th century helps explain why Romulus Augustulus could vanish so completely. The Western Roman Empire was already a shell by 476 CE, controlling only Italy and having no effective military or administrative apparatus. The deposition of Romulus marked a symbolic rather than practical change. Odoacer simply stopped pretending there was a Roman emperor and ruled Italy directly under nominal Byzantine suzerainty. In this context, a deposed teenage ex-emperor had zero political importance and zero reason for anyone to keep track of him. He was irrelevant the moment he was deposed, explaining why no one bothered documenting his later life. The mystery of Romulus Augustulus ultimately reveals how easily people can vanish from history, even in relatively well-documented periods. We have more sources for 5th century Italy than for most ancient periods, yet we still can't determine what happened to the last Western Roman emperor. If someone wanted to disappear or was allowed to fade into obscurity, they could do so completely, especially if they had no particular importance beyond a temporary ceremonial role they'd briefly held. From which country are you watching this? Because the disappearance of Romulus Augustulus shows how quickly formerly important people can become irrelevant and forgotten, and how the end of even thousand-year institutions can be remarkably undramatic in personal terms. What figures from your country's history vanished into obscurity after playing significant roles? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're struck by how the last Roman emperor simply disappeared, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to explore other mysterious imperial disappearances and examine why even powerful Romans could vanish without trace. Chapter 4. Other Vanished Emperors, a Catalogue of Mysterious Fates Beyond Valerian's Capture, the Crisis of the 3rd Century's Chaos, and Romulus Augustulus's retirement into complete obscurity. Roman history contains numerous other emperors and imperial claimants whose fates remain mysterious, whose deaths are poorly documented, or who vanished under circumstances that historians still debate. These cases range from usurpers who ruled for weeks before disappearing, to legitimate emperors whose ultimate fate is unclear, from Byzantine emperors whose deaths in battle can't be confirmed to child emperors who were deposed and then possibly murdered years later. Together, these mysterious disappearances reveal how fragile historical memory can be and how easily even important people could vanish from the historical record when political circumstances made documentation inconvenient or when chaos prevented reliable recording of events. Emperor Hostilian, who co-ruled briefly with his brother Trebonianus Gallus in 251 CE, supposedly died of plague in Rome. This seems straightforward enough. Plague was ravaging the empire during this period, and many people died from disease. But some ancient sources hint at darker possibilities, suggesting that Hostilian's death was suspiciously convenient for his co-emperor Gallus, who benefited from being sole ruler after Hostilian's death. Did Hostilian actually die of plague, or was he murdered and the plague provided a convenient cover story? We'll never know because the sources are vague, contradictory, and written after the fact by people with no direct knowledge. Hostilian's body was presumably buried in Rome, but we don't know where, and no monument or memorial survives to mark his resting place. The case of Emperor Pupienus and Balbinus, who co-ruled for 99 days in 238 CE during the year of the Six Emperors, is equally mysterious. Both were supposedly murdered by the Praetorian Guard in a palace coup, but the circumstances are confused. Were they killed in the imperial palace? Were they dragged through the streets? What happened to their bodies? The sources provide dramatic but contradictory accounts that read more like fiction than historical documentation. One source claims their bodies were thrown in the street and desecrated. Another suggests they received proper burial. A third implies their bodies were never recovered. The truth is that 2 Roman emperors died violently in Rome in 238 CE, and despite this happening in the capital city, with presumably many witnesses, we don't have reliable accounts of the events or what happened to their remains. Emperor Decius, who ruled 249–251 CE and vigorously persecuted Christians, died fighting the Goths at the Battle of Abritus in 251 CE. This much is certain, but what exactly happened to him during or after the battle is unclear. Some sources say he died fighting bravely in the battle. Others suggest he was killed while trying to flee. Still others claim he became trapped in a swamp and was killed there, with his body never recovered. The confusion suggests that the battle was chaotic, the Roman defeat was complete, and no one who survived had clear knowledge of the emperor's final moments. Decius's body was apparently never recovered for burial in Rome, meaning the emperor simply disappeared into the swamps and forests of the Balkans. His body left wherever he fell. The child emperor Gratian, who was elevated to Augustus by his father Valentinian I in 367 CE, when he was only 8 years old, ruled as senior Western emperor from 375–383 CE, before being murdered during a revolt led by the usurper Magnus Maximus. Gratian was killed near Lugdunum, modern Lyon, France, in August 383 CE while trying to flee to Italy. The circumstances of his death are documented. He was caught and murdered by Maximus's forces, but what happened to his body afterward is unclear. Was he buried properly? Was his body returned to his family? Was he buried where he fell? Some sources suggest he was buried in Lugdunum, but no tomb has been identified. A Roman emperor who ruled for years as Senior Augustus simply disappeared into the ground, somewhere in Gaul with no known grave marker. Emperor Majorian, who ruled the Western Empire 457–461 CE, and was one of the last effective Western emperors who actually tried to restore Roman power, was deposed and murdered in 461 CE by his Magister Militum, Master of Soldiers, Ricimer. Majorian had attempted reforms and military campaigns that threatened Ricimer's power, so Ricimer had him arrested, forced to abdicate, and then executed. The sources agree on the general outline but are vague about the specific circumstances. Where was Majorian killed? What happened to his body? Was he buried with any ceremony? The answers are lost. Ricimer apparently disposed of Majorian quickly and quietly to avoid creating a martyr or rallying point for opposition, and in doing so ensured that one of the last capable Western emperors vanished from history with minimal documentation. Anthemius, who ruled the Western Empire 467–472 CE, was killed when Ricimer, yes, the same Ricimer who killed Majorian, besieged and captured Rome in 472 CE. Anthemius had been appointed emperor by the Eastern Emperor Leo I as part of an attempt to stabilize the West, but he came into conflict with Ricimer, leading to civil war. When Ricimer's forces captured Rome after a siege, Anthemius was killed, but how and where exactly is unclear. Some sources say he was killed trying to flee the city disguised as a beggar. Others suggest he was captured and executed. The location of his death and what happened to his body are unknown. A Roman emperor died violently in Rome itself, and we can't determine the basic facts of how it happened. Olybrius, who succeeded Anthemius and ruled for just a few months in 472 CE, died in November of that year. The sources say he died of disease, which given the period's health conditions is certainly plausible. But Olybrius's brief reign, his elevation by Ricimer, and his convenient death just a few months into his reign have made some historians suspicious. Did he actually die of disease, or was his death helped along by political rivals? Was he poisoned? Did he die of natural causes but was given a suspiciously quick burial to avoid questions? We'll never know because the sources provide minimal details and Olybrius's reign was so brief that few people paid much attention to him. Julius Nepos, the emperor who was deposed by Romulus Augustulus's father Orestes in 475 CE, fled to Dalmatia, where he continued claiming to be the legitimate Western Roman emperor until his assassination in 480 CE. The circumstances of his assassination are somewhat documented. He was killed by supporters of the previous Dalmatian governor Glycerius, whom Nepos had deposed, but the specific details are vague. Who exactly killed him? Where did the assassination occur? What happened to his body? Even though Nepos was killed in 480 CE, well into the historical period with multiple sources available, we have only the barest outline of his death and fate. The Byzantine emperor Romanus IV Diogenes, who ruled 1068-1071 CE, provides a later example of an emperor whose ultimate fate is mysterious, despite occurring in a relatively well-documented period. Romanus was captured by the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, one of the most important battles in Byzantine history. He was eventually released after agreeing to a treaty, returned to Constantinople but was then deposed by rivals and blinded, a standard Byzantine punishment for deposed emperors. After being blinded, Romanus was exiled to the island of Prote, where he supposedly died in 1072 from infections resulting from his blinding. But some sources suggest he might have been murdered in exile, and the infection story was a convenient explanation. His body's location and burial site are unknown. Emperor Maurice, who ruled the Byzantine Empire 582-602 CE, was overthrown by a military rebellion led by Phocas. Maurice and his 5 sons were captured as they tried to flee Constantinople. What happened next is documented, but the details are confused and probably exaggerated. The sources claim Maurice was forced to watch as his sons were executed one by one before being killed himself. But how much of this is accurate versus theatrical embellishment by later chroniclers? Where were they buried? Some sources say their bodies were thrown in the sea. Others suggest they were buried on the Asian side of Constantinople. Still others claim they were buried in a monastery. The truth is that a Byzantine emperor and his 5 sons were murdered in 602 CE, and despite this being one of the most significant political events of the era, we can't determine with certainty what happened to their bodies. The pattern across all these cases reveals several recurring themes. First, violent deaths in chaotic circumstances often left no reliable witnesses or created situations where witnesses had incentives to lie or embellish. Second, political considerations often meant that bodies were disposed of quickly without proper ceremony to avoid creating martyrs or rallying points for opposition. Third, the distinction between dying of natural causes versus being murdered was often blurred when the death was politically convenient for rivals. Fourth, even emperors who died in major cities with many potential witnesses could disappear into historical fog when circumstances were chaotic and record-keeping was disrupted. The class and status factors also mattered. Emperors who died with loyal supporters who controlled their bodies typically received proper burial and documentation. Emperors who died surrounded by enemies or who were killed by rivals typically had their bodies disposed of quickly, with minimal ceremony and documentation. Emperors who died in remote locations during military campaigns often had their bodies lost or buried in unknown locations. The fate of an emperor's body and the documentation of their death depended heavily on who controlled the narrative and what their political interests, where the archaeological limitations are significant because most of these emperors' burial locations are unknown, making confirmation through archaeology impossible. Even if we knew roughly where an emperor was buried, identifying remains from the 3rd–6th centuries CE is extremely difficult without excellent preservation conditions and clear identifying artifacts. DNA analysis could potentially identify imperial remains if we had good reference samples from known imperial family members, but such samples are rare. Most of these mystery cases will probably never be resolved through archaeology. The medieval and Renaissance legends that grew up around some vanished emperors show how mysterious disappearances inspire fictional elaboration. Tales circulated about emperors who didn't really die but went into hiding, about emperors who lived secretly for decades after their supposed deaths, about emperors whose ghosts haunted former palaces. These legends reflect both the fascination with mysterious disappearances and the tendency to fill historical gaps with imaginative fiction when reliable information is unavailable. From which country are you watching this? Because the catalog of vanished emperors shows that this wasn't just one or two mysterious cases, but a recurring pattern throughout Roman history, revealing systemic issues with documentation, preservation of historical memory, and the political manipulation of historical narratives. What patterns do you notice in how historical figures from your country are remembered or forgotten? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're struck by how many emperors simply vanished, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to explore the systematic reasons why even the most powerful people could disappear from history. Chapter 5. Why Emperors Vanished. The Mechanics of Historical Disappearance Understanding. Why Roman emperors, the most powerful, most documented, most important people in the ancient world, could vanish from history without trace requires examining the systematic failures of historical record-keeping, the political incentives that encouraged suppression of information, the physical vulnerabilities that made preserving bodies and monuments difficult, and the fundamental limitations of ancient documentation that modern people often underestimate. These weren't random, unfortunate losses, but rather predictable results of how ancient societies recorded history, how power operated in Rome, and how easily information could be lost when institutional continuity was disrupted. The mystery isn't really why emperors vanished, but rather why any historical information survived at all given the challenges. The political incentives for suppressing information about emperors' deaths were enormous and operated at multiple levels. New emperors who gained power through deposing or murdering their predecessors had obvious reasons to obscure the details of how the previous emperor died. If the death involved murder, treason, or particularly shameful circumstances, documenting it honestly would undermine the new emperor's legitimacy. The official version would therefore emphasize the previous emperor's unworthiness, the necessity of his removal, and present the new emperor as saving Rome rather than as a usurper or murderer. This political sanitizing of history meant that embarrassing details were suppressed, buried, or never recorded in official sources. The families and supporters of vanquished emperors also had incentives to either suppress information or to create alternative narratives. If your relative or patron was deposed and killed, publicly mourning them or demanding proper burial could mark you as disloyal to the new regime and endanger your life and property. It was often safer to simply forget the previous emperor existed, avoid discussing his fate, and demonstrate loyalty to the new order. This collective forgetting, driven by self-preservation, created informational voids where even people who knew what happened chose not to record it or discuss it publicly. The Senate and aristocratic class, which provided most historical writers, had to navigate between documenting history honestly and avoiding offending whoever currently held power. Senatorial historians writing during an emperor's reign couldn't honestly document that emperor's crimes without risking execution. Historians writing after an emperor's death still had to be careful not to offend the successor or powerful factions. This created incentives for vagueness, euphemism, and strategic silence about controversial events. The result was historical sources that documented what was politically safe to document while leaving gaps around sensitive topics like how unpopular emperors actually died. The chaos of civil wars and foreign invasions disrupted institutional record-keeping in fundamental ways. The imperial bureaucracy maintained extensive records including correspondence, financial accounts, military reports, and administrative documents. But these archives were vulnerable to destruction during wars, fires, and political upheavals. When rival emperors fought for control, their armies often destroyed cities, burned buildings, and killed officials, destroying the records these officials maintained. A well-documented emperor's reign could become a historical mystery simply because the archives documenting it were burned during the next civil war. The reliance on literary sources rather than documentary archives meant that historical information survived only if someone wrote it down in a literary work that was then copied and preserved. Ancient Rome didn't have newspapers, didn't have official governmental press releases in the modern sense, and didn't systematically archive documents in ways that ensured long-term preservation. Historical knowledge depended on historians deciding to write about events, and then those histories surviving through manuscript copying across centuries. If no historian documented an emperor's fate, or if their work was lost, the information disappeared regardless of how many people originally knew it. The vulnerability of manuscript transmission meant that even well-documented events could become mysterious if the manuscripts recording them were lost. Ancient and medieval manuscripts were copied by hand, requiring enormous labor and expense. Only texts considered important enough or popular enough got copied repeatedly. If an historical work survived in only one or two manuscript copies, the loss of those manuscripts through fire, war, decay, or simple neglect meant the information in them was lost forever. We know from references in surviving works that many historical texts existed that are now completely lost, taking their information with them into oblivion. The geographic dispersion of information created problems because events happening in different parts of the empire might be documented in different locations, and those local records might never make it into the empire-wide historical tradition. An emperor who died in Britain might have his death documented by local officials or observers in Britain. But if that information never reached historians in Rome or Constantinople, it might never enter the historical mainstream. The fragmentation of historical knowledge across different regions meant that synthesizing comprehensive narratives was difficult even for contemporary historians, much less for later scholars trying to reconstruct events from fragmentary sources. The time lag between events and historical documentation meant that historians often wrote about events years or decades after they occurred, relying on hearsay, rumor, and politically colored accounts rather than direct observation. The longer the time lag, the more likely that details would be forgotten, confused, or deliberately distorted. An emperor's mysterious death might have been clearly understood by people at the time, but if no one wrote it down immediately and later, historians tried to reconstruct events from contradictory oral traditions decades later. The truth could be lost even if the event was fairly recent. The lack of forensic science meant that confirming deaths and identifying bodies was far more difficult than in modern times. If an emperor was killed in a remote location and his body wasn't immediately recovered, there was no reliable way to confirm his death or identify remains later found. Bodies decayed quickly, especially in warm climates, making identification impossible after even a short time. The ancient world had no DNA testing, no dental records, no fingerprints, no reliable methods for confirming identity except personal recognition by people who knew the individual. This meant that claims about what happened to an emperor's body were essentially unverifiable, unless multiple reliable witnesses confirmed them. The political use of emperors' bodies in burial sites meant that what happened to a dead emperor was as much a political decision as a practical one. Did the new regime want to honor the previous emperor with proper burial and monuments? Or did they want to erase his memory? Did they want to create a tomb that supporters could visit? Or did they want to prevent the creation of a pilgrimage site for opposition? These political calculations determined whether bodies were carefully preserved and documented or quickly disposed of in unmarked locations. The disappearance of an emperor's body often reflected a deliberate choice to erase him from memory rather than accidental loss. The social changes of late antiquity contributed to historical information loss as the institutions that preserved classical learning declined. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE meant that the libraries, schools, and aristocratic culture that had maintained historical knowledge were disrupted. Manuscript copying became less systematic, fewer people could read Greek and Latin, and the priorities of societies changed from preserving pagan historical texts to preserving Christian religious texts. Many historical works that documented emperors' fates were probably lost during this transition because they were considered less important than theological works. The material fragility of ancient texts compounded all these other problems. Papyrus scrolls decayed relatively quickly, requiring periodic recopying to preserve their content. Parchment manuscripts lasted longer but were expensive, making them vulnerable to being scraped clean and reused for other texts, a process called palimpsesting that destroyed countless ancient works. Fire, water, insects, and simple aging all threatened manuscripts. Libraries burned with shocking frequency, the Library of Alexandria's various destructions being only the most famous example. Every manuscript lost meant information gone forever if it wasn't preserved in other copies. The Christian transformation of the Roman world affected which historical information was preserved, because Christian monks and scribes who copied manuscripts prioritized works they considered morally or religiously valuable. Historical works that focused on pagan emperors' achievements might be considered less worth preserving than works with Christian moral messages. The result was that some historical information survived because it aligned with Christian values, while other information was lost because copyists didn't prioritize it. The survival of historical knowledge became partly a matter of theological judgment rather than just historical importance. The Byzantine continuation of Roman Empire in the East preserved more institutional continuity than the West, but Byzantine historians focused primarily on events in their own region and period, often giving less attention to Western events in earlier periods. This meant that information about Western emperors, especially during the chaotic 3rd–5th centuries, was sometimes preserved less systematically than information about contemporary Byzantine emperors. The split between Eastern and Western empires created historiographical divides that affected what information was preserved, where the modern archaeological limitations mean we can't easily recover information about vanished emperors even with current technology. Most burial sites are unknown, making excavation impossible. Even known imperial burial sites have often been looted, destroyed, or so disturbed that archaeological evidence is compromised. The techniques for identifying ancient remains while improving still require excellent preservation and comparative materials that often don't exist for 3rd–6th century emperors. Unless we get remarkably lucky with new discoveries, most of these mysteries will remain unsolved because the physical evidence is simply gone. The lesson from all this is that historical knowledge is far more fragile and contingent than most people realize. We know things about the past not because information naturally survives, but because specific chains of preservation happen to work. Someone wrote it down. Their work got copied. The copies survived fires and wars. Later copyists considered it worth preserving. The manuscripts ended up in libraries that survived, and modern scholars found and translated them. Every step in this chain was vulnerable to failure, and when any step failed, information was lost. The marvel isn't that some emperors vanished without trace, but that we know anything at all about most emperors, given how many ways information could be lost. From which country are you watching this? Because the mechanisms by which emperors vanished from history, political suppression, institutional failure, manuscript loss, deliberate erasure, operate across cultures and time periods, affecting what we know about the past everywhere. What aspects of your country's history have been lost, suppressed, or distorted through similar mechanisms? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're struck by how fragile historical memory is, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to conclude our investigation with reflections on what these mysterious disappearances mean for understanding history and human memory. Conclusion. Our investigation of Roman emperors who vanished without trace has taken us from Valerian's capture and mysterious fate in Persian captivity, through the crisis of the 3rd century when emperors died faster than historians could document, to the complete disappearance of Romulus Augustulus after his deposition, across a catalog of other mysteriously vanished rulers, and finally into the systematic reasons why even the most powerful, most documented people in the ancient world could completely disappear from history. What we've discovered is that these weren't freak accidents or anomalies, but rather predictable results of how ancient societies recorded history, how power politics encouraged suppression of embarrassing information, and how fragile the transmission of historical knowledge actually is. Valerian's fate represents the ultimate imperial nightmare: capture by a foreign enemy, humiliation, and a death so obscure that even 17 centuries later we can't determine what actually happened to him. The wild stories about human footstools and flayed skin might be true, might be propaganda, or might be complete fabrications. The fact that we can't distinguish between these possibilities shows how thoroughly information can be lost even about major historical events. Valerian's disappearance wasn't some accident in a remote corner of history, but happened to a reigning Roman emperor during his lifetime. Yet the historical record provides nothing definitive about his ultimate fate. The crisis of the 3rd century demonstrated that institutional collapse creates informational chaos. When emperors were dying every few months, when civil wars destroyed archives, when plague killed potential witnesses, when political instability made honest documentation dangerous, historical knowledge simply evaporated. The 50 emperors in 50 years weren't just a political catastrophe but a historiographical catastrophe that created permanent gaps in our knowledge. Some of these men ruled the entire Roman Empire, yet we can't determine basic facts about how they died or what happened to their bodies because the systems for preserving information failed under stress. Romulus Augustulus' complete disappearance after 476 CE shows that irrelevance erases memory more effectively than any active suppression. He wasn't murdered and his death covered up. He simply stopped being important enough for anyone to bother documenting his continued existence. The last Western Roman emperor vanished because no one cared what happened to a deposed teenage puppet with no remaining power or significance. This teaches a sobering lesson. Historical memory requires not just that information exists, but that someone considers it important enough to preserve. The catalogue of other vanished emperors, Hostilian, Pupienus Balbinus Decius Gratian Majorian Anthemius, and others, reveals that these mysteries weren't exceptional but rather routine. Throughout Roman history, especially during periods of instability, emperors disappeared with minimal documentation. The pattern was so common that it almost seems strange when we do have detailed, reliable information about an emperor's death and burial. The normal condition was incomplete information, confusing sources, and permanent uncertainty about even major historical events. The systematic reasons for these disappearances reveal how historical knowledge depends on chains of preservation that are vulnerable at every link. Political incentives to suppress information, institutional failures during chaos, manuscript losses through fire and decay, geographic fragmentation of information, lack of forensic methods, and deliberate erasure all contributed to emperors vanishing from history. Understanding these mechanisms makes historical knowledge seem miraculous rather than ordinary. The fact that we know anything at all about the ancient world is remarkable given how many ways information could be lost. The broader implications extend beyond Roman history to how we understand the past generally. Every culture's historical record contains similar gaps where important people and events disappeared because of institutional failures, political suppression, or simple accidents of preservation. The historical record isn't a complete objective account of the past, but rather a fragmentary survival of information that happened to be preserved through chains of contingency. Recognizing this fragility should make us more humble about historical claims and more appreciative of the information we do have. The political dimension of historical disappearances reminds us that what we know about the past is partly determined by power, who controlled narratives, whose stories got preserved, whose achievements got commemorated, and whose failures got suppressed or erased. The vanished emperors often disappeared because someone powerful had reasons to suppress information about them. This pattern of power shaping historical memory operates across all times and places, meaning that historical knowledge is always partly a political construct reflecting the interests of those who preserved it. The mystery and fascination of these disappearances won't end, because we lack the evidence to ever definitively solve most of these cases. Valerian's ultimate fate will probably never be known with certainty. Romulus Augustulus' later life will likely remain a complete mystery. The deaths of dozens of crises of the 3rd century emperors will continue being debated inconclusively. These permanent mysteries are frustrating for historians who want definitive answers, but they're also valuable reminders that uncertainty is a fundamental part of historical knowledge and that acknowledging what we don't know is as important as claiming what we do. No, the human dimension of these stories deserves emphasis. These were real people who lived, ruled, and died, often violently and traumatically. Valerian was a man in his 60s who ended his life in captivity among enemies. Romulus Augustulus was a teenager whose father's ambitions destroyed his life before it really began. The crisis emperors were men, often competent and brave, who died trying to hold together a collapsing empire. The fact that their fates are now mysteries doesn't erase their humanity or the tragedy of their ends. It just means we can't fully document that tragedy. The archaeological hope that future discoveries might solve some of these mysteries is real but should be tempered with realism